The shuttle doors opened with a soft hiss. Commander Sarah Chen stepped onto the metal floor of Kepler Station. She carried one small bag and wore the standard Academy uniform. The fabric covered her arms and hands completely. Around her, the station buzzed with activity from dozens of different alien species. The Galactic Naval Academy was the most important military school in known space. Only the best warriors and strategists from across the galaxy earned a place here. Sarah was the first human ever accepted into their elite programs. She walked through the corridors, following the signs to the registration hall. Other students moved past her in groups. They were tall, short, covered in scales, made of crystal, or had multiple arms. All of them stared at her as she passed. She could hear whispers in various alien languages. The registration hall was enormous. Hundreds of students from different worlds gathered in small groups. Sarah approached the check-in desk where a robotic assistant scanned her identification. Commander Sarah Chen, Sol System Earth, the robot announced in a loud voice. The hall fell quiet for a moment. Every eye turned toward her. Then the whispers started again, louder this time. Sarah found an empty spot near a wall and waited for the orientation to begin. She pulled out a tablet and began reading about her classmates. The information was basic, but she wanted to learn what she could. A group of large reptilian beings approached her. They were Crithari, known across the galaxy as fierce warriors. Their leader was massive, with dark green scales and yellow eyes. His uniform showed the rank of general. "So you are the human," he said in accented Standard Galactic. "I am General Vextar of the Crithari Empire. I must ask, what experiment is this?" "I'm sorry?" Sarah looked up from her tablet. "Why would the Academy waste a position on your species? Humans have barely left their home system. Your people still use chemical rockets, yes? We were conquering star systems when your ancestors lived in caves." Other aliens began gathering around them. Sarah could see curiosity in their expressions. Some looked amused. A being with 6 arms and blue skin stepped forward. "I am Commander Zixal of the Nexari Federation. General Vextar raises good questions. What possible military experience could a human bring to this academy?" "Perhaps they needed someone to represent the primitive species," suggested a crystalline creature that sparkled in the light. "I am Strategic Analyst Dykesal. In my 300 years of study, I have never seen a species advance so slowly as yours." She was shorter than most of the aliens around her, but she met their eyes calmly. "I'm here to learn, just like everyone else." This brought laughter from several students. "Learn?" General Vextar's voice was loud enough that the entire hall could hear. "Child, my people have been fighting wars since before your son was born. The Crithari Empire has conquered 1,000 worlds. What could you possibly teach us about warfare?" "Nothing, I'm sure," Sarah replied quietly. "At least she knows her place," said Commander Zixal. "Perhaps she can help with supply management or communication support. Simple tasks." More laughter rippled through the crowd. Sarah noticed that even species who usually didn't get along with each other were united in their amusement at her presence. A tall, thin being with pale skin and large black eyes stepped closer. "I am Psychic Commander Velnari of the Zephyrian Collective. I sense no hostility from this human, only determination." How curious for such a primitive mind. "Determination to do what?" asked Strategic Analyst Fixal. "Her species has been in space for less than 200 years. They have never fought a real war against an advanced civilization. They know nothing of galactic military doctrine." Sarah listened to all of this without showing emotion. She had expected this reception. The other students continued to discuss her as if she wasn't there. "I heard Earth was discovered by a Crithari survey team," said another student. "They found humans using metal weapons and flying in chemical-powered aircraft, like children playing with toys. The galaxy felt sorry for them, added Commander Zixal. That's why they were given protected status instead of being conquered immediately. General Vextar nodded. My grandfather told stories about the first contact. The humans tried to fight with projectile weapons, throwing metal bullets at energy shields and plasma cannons. The crowd found this especially funny. Sarah noticed that some instructors were watching from across the hall, but they did nothing to stop the conversation. I wonder what combat simulations will be like with a human participant, mused strategic analyst Thixal. Perhaps we should create scenarios involving stone tools and animal cavalry. Or chemical explosives, suggested Commander Velnari with amusement. I believe humans still use those in their primitive wars. Sarah put her tablet away and adjusted her uniform jacket. The sleeves stayed firmly in place, covering her hands and wrists completely. Tell me, human, said General Vextar, leaning down to look at her directly, what is the greatest military victory in your species' history? I'm curious to hear about these primitive accomplishments. I suppose that depends on how you define victory. Defeating a superior enemy force through tactical brilliance, said strategic analyst Thixal. Surely even humans have some small examples. We've had our moments, Sarah replied simply. Oh, please share, said Commander Zixal. We would love to hear about human tactical brilliance. The crowd pressed closer, clearly expecting entertainment. Sarah looked around at all the eager faces, waiting for her to embarrass herself. I think I'll save those stories for class, she said. This brought more laughter. Wise choice, said General Vextar. No need to embarrass yourself before the real education begins. An announcement echoed through the hall, calling all students to their dormitory assignments. The crowd began to break up, but the whispers and glances continued. Sarah picked up her bag and headed toward the dormitory section. Behind her, she could hear the other students still talking. This will be the easiest class ever, said someone. The human will probably fail the first simulation, said another. I almost feel sorry for her, added a third voice. Sarah walked calmly through the corridors of the academy. Her expression remained neutral, but her eyes were alert. She observed everything, the layout of the station, the behavior of different species, the way they moved and interacted. In her dormitory room, Sarah unpacked her few belongings. She sat at the small desk and opened her tablet again. This time, she wasn't reading about her classmates. She was reviewing tactical manuals and strategic frameworks. Outside her window, she could see the stars. Somewhere among them was Earth. Her home seemed very far away now. Sarah rolled up her sleeves, just enough to check her chronometer. As she did, the edge of a complex tattoo became visible on her wrist. She quickly pulled the sleeve back down and returned to her studies. Tomorrow, the real education would begin. The first day of classes began early. Sarah arrived at the Tactical Simulation Center before most other students. She wanted to familiarize herself with the equipment. The room contained dozens of holographic projection tables and neural interface chairs designed for various alien anatomies. Professor Thixal entered the room, his crystalline body catching the light from multiple angles. He was the same strategic analyst who had mocked her yesterday, but now he wore instructor robes. Welcome to Advanced Void Tactics, he announced as students filed in. You will work in teams to solve complex military problems. These simulations are based on real galactic conflicts. Sarah took a seat in the back row. The other students naturally formed groups based on their species or previous alliances. No one approached her. Your first exercise involves defending a space station against overwhelming enemy forces, Professor Thixal continued. You have limited resources and must coordinate your defense using realistic physics and weapons systems. The students divided into teams of 5. Sarah found herself alone. General Vextar looked back at her. I suppose we could add the human to our team. We might need someone to manage supply inventories, he said. His teammates laughed. Commander Zixal nodded. Yes, let her handle the boring details while we plan the real strategy. Sarah joined their group without comment. The team gathered around a holographic display showing their scenario. They controlled a mining station with minimal defenses, facing an incoming fleet of 30 enemy ships. Obviously, we concentrate our defensive platforms here, said General Vextar, pointing to the station's main docking bay. Standard Krithari doctrine. Meet them head-on with maximum firepower. Agreed, said Commander Zixal. The Nexari approach would be similar. Mass our defensive forces and destroy them as they approach. The other team members nodded. They began positioning their simulated weapons and ships according to their traditional tactical doctrines. Human, said General Vextar without looking at her. Monitor our supply consumption rates. Make sure we don't run out of ammunition. Sarah watched the tactical display carefully. She noticed several important details that the others had missed. But when she started to speak, Commander Zixal interrupted her. Just watch the numbers, human. Leave the tactics to those who understand them. The simulation began. The enemy fleet approached in a standard attack formation. General Vextar's defensive plan worked exactly as expected, for about 10 minutes. Then the enemy began using tactics that weren't in any galactic military manual. They're not engaging our main defensive line, said one teammate with confusion. Their smaller ships are moving behind the asteroid field, observed another. That makes no tactical sense. Sarah watched as the enemy used the asteroids to hide their movements. They weren't trying to break through the main defense at all. Instead, they were positioning for attacks on the station's weak points, points that standard galactic doctrine said were too heavily defended to bother with. We're losing sensor contact with enemy units, reported Commander Zixal. This is impossible. Our sensors should penetrate that asteroid field. Not if they're using the iron content to create interference, Sarah said quietly. What? General Vextar turned toward her with irritation. If they detonate small charges against them, they could create electromagnetic interference. It would blind our sensors in that sector. Ridiculous, scoffed General Vextar. No civilized military would waste resources on such primitive tactics. 30 seconds later, the enemy fleet emerged from behind the asteroid field and struck the station's power generation facility. The team's carefully planned defense collapsed as their weapons lost power. Simulation failed, announced Professor Thixall. Time to failure, 14 minutes, 37 seconds. The team stared at the display in shock. According to their military training, their defense should have held for at least an hour. The enemy used non-standard tactics, complained Commander Zixal. This scenario must be flawed. Professor Thixall's crystalline features shifted in what might have been amusement. The scenario is based on the Battle of Kepler's Gate, where a small rebel force defeated a much larger Federation fleet. The tactics you just witnessed are historically accurate. General Vextar's scales darkened with anger. Those rebels must have had help from advanced civilizations. Primitive species cannot develop such tactics on their own. Actually, said Professor Thixall, records show the rebel force was primarily composed of recently contacted species. They had little formal military training. Sarah remained quiet, but she recognized the tactics. She had studied the Battle of Kepler's Gate extensively, though from a different perspective than what the galactic histories recorded. The next exercise involved a planetary assault scenario. Again, Sarah's team assigned her to logistics, while they planned the real strategy. Again, they used standard galactic military doctrine, and again, they failed when the enemy employed unconventional tactics. This is becoming frustrating, muttered one of her teammates. These scenarios seem designed to favor primitive thinking. Perhaps that's the point, said Commander Zixal thoughtfully. Professor, are we being tested on our ability to think outside established doctrine? Professor Thixall's response was non-committal. The galaxy is full of species with different approaches to warfare. A complete military education must consider all possibilities. During the break between simulations, Sarah overheard conversations from other teams. They were having similar problems. Tactics that had won countless real battles throughout galactic history were failing against these simulation enemies. "It's like they can predict our every move," complained one student. "They exploit weaknesses that shouldn't matter," said another. "Standard doctrine exists for good reasons," argued a third. "These scenarios are unrealistic." Sarah knew better. The scenarios weren't unrealistic. They were just based on conflicts that the galactic powers preferred not to discuss in detail. Conflicts where technologically inferior forces had achieved impossible victories through creativity and determination. The afternoon brought physical training. The Academy's gymnasium was designed to challenge multiple species simultaneously. Krathari strength stations, Nexari agility courses, Vorthak endurance challenges, and Zephyrian mental focus exercises. Sarah struggled with exercises designed for alien physiologies. The Krathari strength stations required her to lift weights that seemed impossible for human bone and muscle structure. The Nexari agility courses were built for beings with 6 arms and enhanced reflexes. "Look at the human trying to keep up," laughed one student as Sarah attempted a climbing exercise designed for beings with natural claws. "Perhaps we should set up a special course for primitive species," suggested another. "Something involving running from predators." General Vextar watched her struggle with obvious satisfaction. This is what happens when admission standards are lowered for diversity purposes. The human cannot even complete basic physical requirements. Sarah completed each exercise, though often finishing last, and with obvious difficulty. She said nothing about the fact that many of these challenges were designed for species with entirely different body structures and evolutionary backgrounds. During combat training, the pattern continued. The Academy used training weapons adapted for different species, but the techniques were based on galactic standard doctrine. Sarah's teammates automatically assigned her to support roles. "Stay back and coordinate communications," ordered General Vextar during a team combat exercise. "Leave the fighting to those bred for it." Sarah followed orders without complaint. She watched from the sidelines as her teammates engaged in formalized combat, using techniques that had been refined over thousands of years of galactic warfare. It was effective, but predictable. Every move followed established patterns. Every response was according to doctrine. There was no improvisation, no adaptation to unexpected situations. When the day's classes ended, Sarah returned to her dormitory room. Other students gathered in common areas, discussing the day's failures and forming study groups. No one invited her to join. She sat at her small desk and reviewed the day's lessons. The tactical simulations, the physical challenges, the combat exercises, all of them revealed important information about galactic military thinking. Sarah opened her personal files and began making notes, not about what she had learned from the instructors, but about what she had observed from her classmates, their strengths, their weaknesses, their blind spots. As she worked, her sleeves rolled up slightly, revealing more hints of the intricate artwork beneath. Complex geometric patterns covered her skin, each line and symbol carefully placed. She pulled the sleeves back down and continued writing. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to observe. Sarah was learning a great deal at the Galactic Naval Academy, just not what her instructors thought they were teaching her. 3 weeks into the course, Professor Theixel announced a major examination. The class gathered in the main lecture hall, a circular room with seats arranged to accommodate different alien body types. Sarah sat in her usual place toward the back. "Your next assessment will test your understanding of galactic military history," Professor Theixel announced. His crystalline body pulsed with different colors as he spoke. Each student will analyze a significant conflict and present their findings to the class. He activated a holographic display showing a list of famous battles. These engagements shaped the political structure of our galaxy. The Siege of Andromache 7, which established Krathari dominance in the outer sectors. The Nexari Rebellion, which proved the effectiveness of multi-limb combat coordination. The Crystal Wars, where pure strategic thinking overcame numerical disadvantages. Students began choosing their topics. General Vextar immediately selected the Siege of Andromache 7, a conflict where his own species had achieved a legendary victory. Commander Zixal chose the Nexari Rebellion, naturally wanting to highlight her people's military innovations. Each presentation will be 40 minutes long, Professor Thixal continued. You must demonstrate not only knowledge of events, but analytical understanding of tactics, strategy, and long-term consequences. Sarah waited until other students had made their selections. The list grew shorter as the most famous battles were claimed. Finally, only one conflict remained available. "Ah, Commander Chen," said Professor Thixal, noticing her hesitation. "It appears you will be analyzing the pacification of the Rim worlds. How fitting." Several students chuckled. The pacification was considered a minor police action, barely worth studying. It had occurred about 50 years ago, when several primitive worlds in the Galactic Rim had refused to accept civilized authority. The conflict had lasted longer than expected, but the outcome was never in doubt. The Rim worlds were inhabited by various primitive species, Professor Thixal explained to the class. They possessed no advanced technology, no understanding of modern warfare, and no hope of victory. The conflict is studied primarily as an example of how not to resist superior civilization. General Vextar looked back at Sarah with obvious amusement. Perfect assignment for a human. She can learn how primitive species fail against advanced military doctrine. The rebels managed to prolong the conflict for several years, added Commander Zixal, though of course, they never won a single significant engagement. Sarah nodded calmly. "I'll do my best with the material." General Vextar went first, delivering an impressive analysis of Krathari siege tactics. He spoke with obvious pride about his ancestors' achievements, describing how traditional Krathari doctrine had overcome every defense. The siege lasted 3 years, he explained to the class, but Krathari patience and superior firepower eventually prevailed. The enemy surrendered when they realized continued resistance was hopeless. His presentation included detailed tactical diagrams and historical recordings. The class listened with respect as he explained how proper military doctrine guaranteed victory over any opposition. Commander Zixal followed with her analysis of the Nexari Rebellion. She demonstrated how her people's six-armed physiology had revolutionized close-quarters combat. Her presentation featured sophisticated mathematical models showing optimal attack patterns. Nexari forces achieved victory through superior coordination and tactical flexibility, she concluded. Our natural advantages, combined with proper training, made us unstoppable in hand-to-hand combat. Other presentations continued throughout the week. Strategic analyst Vorthak explained how crystal-based thinking had won the Crystal Wars through pure logical analysis. Psychic Commander Velnari described how telepathic coordination had enabled perfect battlefield communication. Each presentation followed the same pattern: advanced species using natural advantages and sophisticated doctrine to achieve inevitable victory over inferior opponents. Finally, Sarah's turn arrived. She stood at the front of the lecture hall with her research materials. The other students settled back in their seats, clearly expecting entertainment rather than education. The pacification of the Rim worlds, she began simply. A conflict that lasted from 2370 to 2376 Galactic Standard Time. Professor Thixal activated the room's recording systems. All student presentations were documented for official Academy records. According to standard galactic histories, Sarah continued, this was a minor police action against primitive rebels. The outcome was never in doubt, though the conflict lasted longer than anticipated due to logistical challenges. General Vextar nodded approvingly. At least the human understood the basic facts. However, Sarah said, When we examine the tactical details more carefully, some interesting patterns emerge. She activated her own holographic display, showing star charts of the Rimworld's region. The initial galactic force consisted of 3 battle fleets, 1 Krathari, 1 Nexari, and 1 mixed Federation squadron. Total ships, 847 vessels of various classes. The numbers were impressive. Several students whistled at the scale of the operation. The rebel forces possessed approximately 40 modified cargo ships, 30 system patrol boats, and various civilian vessels converted for military use. No energy shields, no faster-than-light weapons, no advanced sensors. Exactly, interrupted General Vextar. Primitive rebels with improvised weapons. The galactic forces should have ended this in weeks. That's what makes the tactical analysis interesting, Sarah replied. Let's examine why it took 6 years instead. She brought up detailed battle records. The first engagement occurred at the Proxima Station system. The galactic fleet approached using standard formation doctrine, expecting quick surrender when the rebels saw the overwhelming force. Sarah highlighted specific ship movements on the display. Instead, she said, the rebels scattered into the system's asteroid field. They used the rocks as cover and forced the galactic fleet to fight in close quarters, where superior numbers became a disadvantage. Cowardly tactics, scoffed Commander Zixal, running and hiding instead of honorable combat. Effective tactics, Sarah corrected gently. The rebels destroyed 18 galactic vessels in that engagement, while losing only 3 of their own. The classroom fell quiet. 18 ships lost to primitive rebels was not mentioned in the standard histories. Sarah continued her analysis, battle by battle. She showed how the rebels had consistently avoided direct confrontation, instead using hit-and-run attacks, improvised weapons, and intimate knowledge of local space to inflict casualties on the superior galactic forces. The Battle of the Iron Nebula is particularly interesting, she said, bringing up new tactical displays. A single rebel squadron managed to disable a Krathari heavy cruiser using nothing but mining charges and electromagnetic pulse devices. General Vextar's scales darkened. That was an equipment malfunction. The official report blamed equipment failure, Sarah agreed. But the technical analysis shows deliberate sabotage. The rebels had somehow infiltrated the ship's systems and turned its own defensive grid against it. She showed the technical diagrams. They used the ship's automated point defense weapons to target its own shield generators. When the shields failed, they struck with concentrated fire at weak points in the armor. Professor Thixel leaned forward with obvious interest. You've studied the classified technical reports? Some details were available in the Academy's archives, Sarah replied diplomatically. The tactical implications are fascinating. These rebels consistently found ways to turn galactic technological advantages against their users. She continued through more battles, each analysis revealing how supposedly primitive rebels had achieved tactical victories that standard galactic doctrine said were impossible. The siege of New Terra lasted 8 months, Sarah explained. The galactic forces had complete orbital control and overwhelming firepower, yet the rebels held out until relief arrived. Relief? Asked Commander Velnari. I don't recall any mention of rebel reinforcements. Sarah smiled slightly. That's because the relief was actually a single fast scout ship that somehow broke through the orbital blockade and evacuated the rebel command structure before the planet fell. She brought up pursuit records. The galactic fleet deployed 43 vessels to intercept this single ship. It escaped anyway, using a combination of gravitational slingshot maneuvers and debris field navigation that no Academy textbook considers possible. The classroom was completely silent now. Every student was staring at the tactical displays, trying to understand how primitive rebels could repeatedly achieve such impossible victories. The conflict finally ended when the galactic government offered the Rimworlds autonomous status, rather than continuing the military campaign, Sarah concluded. Officially, this was presented as merciful policy. Unofficially, the casualty reports suggest that continued warfare was becoming too expensive. She deactivated her displays and returned to her seat. The other students continued staring at her in shock. Professor Thixel's crystalline body pulsed rapidly. Commander Chen, your analysis suggests that the galactic forces were outmaneuvered by primitive opponents. How do you explain this apparent contradiction? Sarah considered her answer carefully. Perhaps the definition of primitive needs to be reconsidered. These rebels may have lacked advanced technology, but they clearly possessed sophisticated understanding of asymmetric warfare. Where, asked General Vexar slowly, did you obtain such detailed tactical information? Many of these battle records are restricted. Sarah looked around the classroom at the faces staring at her. For the first time since arriving at the academy, she had their complete attention. I suppose that depends, she said quietly, on your security clearance level. The lecture hall remained completely silent. Professor Thixel's crystalline body pulsed with colors that indicated deep concentration. General Vextar stared at Sarah with a mixture of suspicion and growing alarm. Security clearance, Professor Thixel repeated slowly. Commander Chen, what exactly do you mean by that? Sarah stood calmly at the front of the room. For weeks she had endured mockery and dismissal from these students. Now every eye was focused on her with intense attention. I mean, she said quietly, that some battle records require personal experience to access. Commander Zixal's 6 arms shifted nervously. Personal experience? But you're human. Your species wasn't involved in the pacification of the rim worlds. Wasn't it? Sarah asked. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Professor Thixel activated his teaching console and began searching through galactic databases. His crystalline features shifted through several colors as he processed information. According to our records, he said carefully, Earth was granted protected status before the Rimworld's conflict began. Humans were specifically excluded from galactic military operations. That's what your records say, Sarah agreed. But records can be incomplete. General Vextar stood up from his seat, his massive frame towering over the other students. What are you suggesting, human? That your primitive species somehow participated in military operations beyond their capability? Sarah looked at him directly. I'm suggesting that capabilities can be underestimated. She walked to the center of the room, where everyone could see her clearly. Slowly, deliberately, she began rolling up the sleeves of her uniform jacket. The fabric had hidden her arms and hands completely since the day she arrived. As the sleeves moved higher, intricate artwork became visible on her skin. Not decorative tattoos, but detailed military records permanently etched in her flesh. Geometric patterns, mathematical formulas, star charts, and tactical diagrams covered every inch of exposed skin. The students gasped collectively. Even Professor Thixel's pulsing colors intensified as he tried to process what he was seeing. Each mark represents an engagement, Sarah explained, extending her left hand for the class to see. A complex spiral pattern covered her palm, with smaller symbols radiating outward like a star chart. This spiral records my participation in the defense of the Sol system when the first Krathari survey fleet arrived. General Vextar's yellow eyes widened. The Sol defense was a minor skirmish. Our ships encountered navigation problems and withdrew. There was no significant combat, Sarah repeated with a slight smile. That's not how I remember it. She showed them her right hand, where interlocking rings formed an intricate pattern around her knuckles. These rings commemorate the Battle of Proxima Station, where I personally led the boarding action that captured the Nexari heavy cruiser Determination. Commander Zixal's 6 arms trembled. The Determination was lost to equipment failure during a training exercise. There was no battle, no boarding action. Equipment failure, Sarah nodded. I suppose that's easier to report than admitting a human strike team took your flagship using nothing but cutting torches and determination. She rolled up her sleeves further, revealing more artwork. A constellation pattern spread across her forearms, each star representing something significant. Lines connected the stars in complex geometric relationships. This constellation maps the Terran Expeditionary Fleet's liberation of 12 enslaved worlds during what you call the pacification period, Sarah continued. Each star represents a successful operation. Each line shows the tactical connections between engagements. The classroom erupted in shocked whispers. Students began accessing their personal databases, searching for information that suddenly seemed unreliable. Professor Thyksal's colors were cycling rapidly now. These claims, they contradict everything in our historical records. The official reports state— The official reports, Sarah interrupted gently, were written by the losers. They needed to explain their failures to their superiors. Equipment malfunctions and navigation errors sound better than admitting defeat by primitive humans. She pointed to a specific symbol on her left wrist. This mark records the Iron Nebula engagement that General Vexstar mentioned earlier. The Krathari heavy cruiser that suffered equipment failure? I was the one who infiltrated its computer systems. General Vexstar was staring at her with growing horror. You're claiming you were personally responsible for the defeat of Admiral Krathvar's flagship. Admiral Krathvar was your uncle, wasn't he? Sarah asked. I remember him. Brave officer, but he relied too heavily on standard Krathari doctrine. He never expected someone to turn his own point defense grid against him. General Vexstar's scales had turned almost black. In Krathari culture, this indicated extreme emotional distress. Sarah continued revealing more tattoos, each one telling a story of impossible human victories. A geometric pattern on her forearm showed the gravitational calculations needed to slingshot a single ship past 43 pursuing vessels. Intricate mathematical formulas recorded the precise timing needed to coordinate multiple simultaneous strikes across different star systems. The scout ship that evacuated New Terra's command structure, she said, showing them a complex navigation diagram tattooed on her inner arm. That was my ship, the Defiant, fastest vessel in the human fleet, but only because we had removed everything non-essential. Life support, artificial gravity, crew quarters. We survived that mission breathing recycled air and drinking our own sweat. Psychic Commander Velnari was staring at Sarah with her large black eyes. As a telepath, she could sense emotional states, and what she was detecting from the human was unlike anything in her experience. I sense no deception, she whispered. Her memories are vast, detailed. She truly experienced these events. Professor Thyksel was accessing deeper database levels now, searching through classified military archives. His crystalline body was pulsing so rapidly that it created a strobe effect in the room. I'm finding references, he announced in a shocked voice. Classified reports that were never made public. Multiple mentions of an unknown enemy designated as Ghost Fleet. Ships that appeared without warning, struck with impossible precision, and vanished before reinforcements could respond. Sarah nodded. That's what your forces called us, the Ghost Fleet. We preferred to think of ourselves as the Terran Expeditionary Force. But why? Asked Commander Zixal. Why hide this information? Why pretend humans weren't involved? Because, Sarah replied, admitting the truth would have required explaining how supposedly primitive humans repeatedly defeated the galaxy's most advanced military forces. That would have raised uncomfortable questions about galactic superiority. She showed them a final tattoo, this one covering the back of her hand, in an intricate pattern that seemed to shift and move in the light. This records my final operation as fleet commander. The negotiation of the Rim World's Autonomy Treaty. Your governments didn't end the war out of mercy. They ended it because continuing would have cost more ships than they could afford to lose. The room fell into stunned silence. Every assumption they had made about human capabilities, about galactic military supremacy, about the natural order of civilized space, had been shattered in minutes. General Vextar slowly sat back down. His voice was barely a whisper. You're the ghost of the Outer Rim, the one our intelligence services have been hunting for 50 years. I've been attending military academies across the galaxy for decades, learning how you think, how you fight, what weaknesses you don't realize you have. No one ever suspected, because no one ever imagined a human could possess such capabilities. She began rolling her sleeves back down, hiding the extensive tattoos once again. The greatest weapon in any conflict is being underestimated by your enemy. You've all been so convinced of human primitiveness that you never bothered to investigate what we were actually capable of. Professor Thixol finally found what he was looking for in the classified databases. His colors shifted to patterns that indicated extreme shock. Commander Sarah Chen, he read from his display. Terran Naval Intelligence, Special Operations Division. Estimated enemy casualties, 847 vessels, 23,000 personnel. Tactical victories achieved, impossible to calculate. Current status. Retired from active duty. Assigned to diplomatic liaison positions. He looked up at Sarah with newfound respect and no small amount of fear. You're not here to learn tactics, he realized. You're here to teach them. Sarah smiled for the first time since arriving at the academy. Every species in this room has been planning for their next war with other galactic powers. Traditional enemies, familiar tactics, predictable doctrine. But the galaxy is changing. New species are being contacted every year. Some of them will be friendly. Others won't. She looked around the room at each shocked student. When you encounter a species that doesn't fight by your rules, that doesn't respect your technological advantages, that refuses to accept the natural order you believe in, what will you do then? The question hung in the air like a challenge. No one had an answer. That, Sarah concluded, is what I'm here to teach you. The Academy's main conference room had never hosted such an unusual gathering. Professor Thixol stood at the head of the table, his crystalline body pulsing with nervous energy. Around the table sat the same students who had mocked Sarah just weeks earlier, but now their attitudes had completely changed. Sarah entered the room wearing a modified uniform that left her tattooed hands visible. The intricate artwork caught the light as she moved, each symbol telling a story of impossible victories. The other students watched her with a mixture of respect, fear, and intense curiosity. I have spoken with Academy leadership, Professor Thixol announced. In light of recent revelations, we are restructuring the remainder of this course. Commander Chen will be taking over tactical instruction. General Vextar, who had spent weeks dismissing humans as primitive, now sat rigidly at attention. His scales had returned to their normal color, but his eyes never left Sarah's tattooed hands. Before we begin, Sarah said, taking her place at the head of the table, I want to address something important. Everything I'm about to teach you is classified at the highest levels. This knowledge doesn't leave this room. Commander Sixal leaned forward, with all 6 arms resting on the table. Commander Chen, I must ask, why reveal yourself now? You could have continued your cover indefinitely. Sarah smiled slightly. Because the galaxy is changing faster than your governments realize. In the past year alone, we've made contact with 17 new species. 3 of them have already demonstrated hostile intentions toward established galactic powers. She activated the room's holographic display, showing star charts of unexplored regions. Traditional galactic doctrine assumes that advanced technology automatically guarantees military superiority. The Rim World's conflict proved that assumption wrong. Now imagine facing an enemy that combines primitive cunning with advanced technology. The implications hit the students immediately. Several exchanged worried glances. The hegemony of Zeta Reticuli, Sarah continued, highlighting a distant star system. First contact occurred 6 months ago. They possess energy weapons more advanced than anything in galactic arsenals. But they also employ tactical thinking that your military academies would consider primitive and dishonorable. Strategic analyst Vorthak's crystalline features shifted through complex patterns. You're suggesting they could defeat conventional galactic forces? I'm not suggesting it, Sarah replied. I'm telling you it's inevitable, unless galactic military thinking evolves quickly. She changed the display to show tactical simulations. Let me demonstrate what I mean. General Vextar, you're commanding a standard Chthari battle group. 12 heavy cruisers, 8 destroyers, 4 carrier vessels. You're facing an enemy fleet of equal size but unknown capabilities. How do you proceed? General Vextar straightened in his chair. Despite his newfound respect for Sarah, decades of Chthari military training took over. Standard formation approach. Heavy units in front to absorb enemy fire. Carriers protected in the rear. Destroyers screening the flanks. Sarah nodded. Exactly what I expected. Commander Zixal, you're the enemy commander. Your ships have superior firepower, but unknown tactical doctrine. What's your response? Commander Zixal considered carefully. If I'm following Nexari doctrine, I would attempt to outmaneuver the Chthari formation, using superior speed and coordination to strike their weak points. Now, let me show you what the hegemony actually did when they encountered a similar Chthari battle group 3 months ago. The tactical display updated to show a real engagement. The alien fleet approached in what appeared to be a standard formation, then suddenly scattered in all directions. Individual ships began performing maneuvers that violated basic tactical principles, flying directly into enemy fire zones, ignoring optimal firing positions, apparently acting without coordination. This looks like chaos, observed Psychic Commander Velnari. Their formation discipline completely collapsed. Watch what happens next, Sarah instructed. The scattered alien ships suddenly converged from multiple angles simultaneously, but instead of targeting the Chthari heavy cruisers, they struck the carrier vessels with overwhelming force. Within minutes, the Chthari fleet had lost all fighter support and long-range strike capability. They sacrificed formation integrity to achieve tactical surprise, Sarah explained. Your doctrine says this should have made them vulnerable to concentrated fire from the heavy cruisers. But they calculated that destroying the carriers was worth the risk. General Vextar was studying the display with intense concentration. The heavy cruisers did engage them. Multiple hits were scored. Yes, Sarah agreed. But the alien ships continued fighting, even with severe damage. Some kept firing until their reactors went critical. They treated their own vessels as expendable resources rather than valuable assets to be preserved. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Galactic military doctrine was built around preserving expensive ships and trained crews. An enemy willing to sacrifice both for tactical advantage would be nearly impossible to defeat using conventional thinking. This is why you're all here, Sarah continued. Not to learn new weapons technology or advanced ship designs, but to learn how to think like your enemies instead of like yourselves. She called up a new simulation scenario. Practical exercise time. I want you to design a defense for this space station using only the resources shown. But you're not defending against a conventional enemy. You're facing opponents who don't value their own lives, don't follow standard tactical doctrine, and consider every piece of equipment expendable. The students gathered around the display, studying the scenario carefully. They had access to a modest defensive force and limited time to prepare. Remember, Sarah added, your enemies won't approach predictably, won't engage your strongest points first, and won't retreat when logic says they should. They'll do whatever causes you the most damage, regardless of cost to themselves. General Vextar began positioning defensive units according to Krathari doctrine, then stopped himself. This is difficult. Everything I've been trained to expect from enemies doesn't apply here. Exactly, Sarah said. Now you're beginning to understand what the galaxy is facing. The students worked for over an hour, repeatedly revising their defensive plans as they tried to think outside their own cultural frameworks. Sarah watched patiently, occasionally offering subtle guidance. Commander Chen, asked strategic analyst Vorthak, how did you learn to think this way? Human military history is brief compared to ours. Where did this tactical insight come from? Sarah considered the question carefully. Humans developed these tactics because we had no choice. When we first encountered galactic civilization, we had two options: surrender or find ways to win against impossible odds. Surrender wasn't acceptable. She gestured to her tattooed hands. Every mark you see here represents a battle where human forces were outnumbered, outgunned, and expected to lose. We survived by learning to think like prey animals fighting predators. We became unpredictable because predictability meant death. Commander Zixal looked up from the tactical display. But humans aren't prey animals anymore. You've proven you can defeat any galactic power. Which is exactly why I'm here, Sarah replied. The next enemy you face might be even more desperate than we were. They might be smarter, more ruthless, or more willing to sacrifice everything for victory. If galactic civilization is going to survive, it needs to learn these lessons before it's too late. The afternoon session focused on psychological warfare and unconventional tactics. Sarah taught them to recognize and counter enemy strategies they had never imagined. Your greatest weakness, she explained, is assuming your enemies think like you do. Krathari expect honorable combat. Nexari expect coordinated teamwork. Vorthak expect logical decision-making. But what happens when you face enemies who value none of these things? As the day ended, the students were exhausted, but energized. For the first time in their military careers, they were learning to see warfare from completely different perspectives. General Vextar approached Sarah as the others filed out. Commander, I owe you an apology. My behavior when you first arrived was inappropriate. Sarah shook her head. Your behavior was exactly what I expected. It's what I was counting on. Counting on? He asked, confused. General, you spent weeks treating me as harmless and ignorant. You discussed classified information in front of me, revealed tactical thinking, showed me weaknesses in galactic doctrine. If you had taken me seriously from the beginning, I would have learned nothing. The realization hit him like a physical blow. You were gathering intelligence. I was doing what humans do best, Sarah replied. I was surviving by being underestimated. She looked around the empty conference room, remembering her first day at the academy, when these same students had mocked her primitive species. The greatest weapon in any conflict isn't superior firepower or advanced technology, she said quietly. It's convincing your enemy that you're not a threat until it's too late for them to respond. General Vextar nodded slowly, finally understanding the lesson. You're teaching us to recognize when we're making the same mistake with future enemies. Exactly, Sarah confirmed. The next species that seems primitive and harmless might be the most dangerous enemy the galaxy has ever faced. When that day comes, I want you to be ready. As she left the academy that evening, Sarah pulled her sleeves down to cover the tattoos once again. Tomorrow there would be new lessons, new challenges, and new opportunities to prepare galactic civilization for the threats it didn't yet recognize. The stars looked the same as they always had, but Sarah knew the galaxy was changing. Somewhere among those distant suns, new species were developing technologies and tactics that would challenge everything the established powers believed about warfare and survival. When that time came, at least some of the galaxy's defenders would be prepared. They would know not to underestimate their enemies, no matter how primitive or harmless they might appear. And if the lessons she taught here weren't enough, if conventional galactic forces proved unable to adapt quickly enough to face unconventional threats, well, Sarah still had her ship. The Defiant was old now, but it had carried her through impossible battles before. The human smile that touched her lips held no warmth. Some lessons could only be learned the hard way, and Sarah Chen had always been an excellent teacher.